Do you believe people can really change? Or do they just get better at hiding things?
My parents sat me down at the kitchen table one evening in early spring, the kind of evening where the air still had a chill, but you could smell the thaw coming. They had that look on their faces, the one where they were about to deliver news they expected me to swallow without complaint. My mother folded her hands as though she were about to pray, while my father leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms with the confidence of someone who believed his word was final. My acceptance letter to college was already pinned to the fridge with a cheap magnet from a roadside diner, the kind of magnet you keep without thinking about it. It was the brightest thing in that dull kitchen, and for weeks I had looked at it every morning as though it were my ticket out of a life, where everything revolved around Ethan, my younger brother. They didn't congratulate me again that night. Instead, my mother cleared her throat and began explaining, almost in rehearsed lines, how money was tight, how bills had stacked up, how they had looked at the numbers over and over and couldn't find a way to contribute to my tuition. My father nodded like an accountant sealing a deal, as if the explanation itself should soothe me. I sat there listening, holding back the urge to laugh, because what they were really saying was, "You're on your own, but don't make us feel guilty about it." I wanted to scream that this was the one chance I had been working for since freshman year of high school. Scholarships, AP classes, clubs, all of it carefully stacked like bricks to build a life beyond this house. Instead, I swallowed hard, nodded, and told them I understood. That was the last time I would ever give them the satisfaction of seeing me beg. 2 weeks later, I heard it before I saw it. The rumble of an engine pulling into the driveway, louder than anything that had ever been parked outside our modest home. I stood at the window and watched Ethan step out of a brand new black pickup truck, its paint still shining like it had just rolled off the lot. A giant red bow sat crooked on the hood, the kind you only ever see in commercials. My mother ran outside clapping, my father grinning like a man who had just conquered the world, and Ethan, 18, spoiled, smug, posed beside the truck like he had earned it. I felt my stomach turn over. Relatives began arriving that afternoon, some with store-bought cakes, others with envelopes of cash, as though buying a truck for my brother was a community achievement. They crowded the driveway, snapping pictures, congratulating him on this so-called milestone, while not a single person mentioned the acceptance letter still hanging on the fridge inside. I stood there, invisible in my own home, and realized something brutal and freeing all at once. I was never going to win their game. I could not make them proud. I could not make them see me. But I could make sure they'd regret underestimating me. That night, after the truck party fizzled and the leftover cake hardened on paper plates, I sat on my bed scrolling through scholarship applications with a fire I had never felt before. I applied to everything, national programs, local contests, even obscure foundations with questions so specific I wondered if anyone else in the country was applying. I wrote essays until my fingers cramped, edited them until dawn, poured every ounce of rage and hope into sentences that would never be read by my family, but might be seen by strangers willing to invest in me. I worked through rejection after rejection, until one day an email arrived that made me gasp so loudly my roommate down the hall thought something terrible had happened. The subject line contained one word: congratulations. I opened it, my hands trembling, and there it was, a full scholarship, for years covered. Tuition, fees, housing, even a small stipend for books. I stared at the screen with tears stinging my eyes, not just because of what it meant for me, but because of what it would mean for them. I didn't have to ask them for a dime. I didn't have to crawl back. I didn't have to thank them for something they had never given. I could walk away, fully and completely, and they would never know how close they had come to losing me until it was too late. When I came home for dinner that night, Ethan bragged about his truck's features: the leather seats, the touchscreen, the way the engine roared when he revved it. My parents listened with rapt attention, hanging on every word, while I silently stirred my food, the acceptance email burning like a secret in my pocket. My mother finally turned to me and asked if I had applied for any more scholarships, her tone light, as if she already assumed I would fail. I looked her in the eye, forced a smile, and said, "Don't worry about me." It was the last time I would give her even that much. In that moment, as the laughter swelled around Ethan's latest story about showing off his truck to girls at school, I felt something inside me settle. I wasn't part of this family anymore, not really. They had chosen their favorite long ago, and I was just a supporting character in their play. But what they didn't know is that I had already started writing my own script. And this script had no role for them. When I finally shut off the light that night, I lay in bed replaying the sound of that scholarship email notification, imagining it echoing through every room of the house. I imagined my name being called 4 years later, not in this kitchen where no one cared, but in a hall filled with applause they would never hear. I imagined them realizing they had bet on the wrong child. And for the first time, I drifted to sleep with a smile, knowing that my silence was going to be the loudest revenge of all. Because I had made a promise to myself, they'd never see me beg again. And they'd never see me coming. Leaving came down to a series of small choices that felt ordinary in the moment, but added up to a clean amputation, like folding shirts into a duffel instead of a suitcase so it looked temporary. Like telling neighbors I was only visiting campus for orientation when I had already signed the housing contract. Like deleting the family shared calendar from my phone and pretending I had simply updated my settings. All of it quiet and practical. None of it theatrical, because I had learned that the most effective exits happen while the other actors are still delivering their lines. I took the earliest bus on a Saturday when Ethan had football practice and my parents were hosting a barbecue, and the relief that hit me when the city slipped away behind the tinted window felt almost indecent. A physical lightness in my chest that made me want to laugh, except I was too busy making lists in my head of what I would need to survive without their help. A campus job that paid weekly, a cheap meal. Plans supplemented with discount groceries, a used bike to avoid bus fares, and a part-time gig I could do at night that wouldn't break me before midterms arrived. The dorm wasn't romantic in the way brochures pretend, with fairy lights and scented candles and girls in sweaters laughing over textbooks. It smelled like stale air and carpet cleaner. And the walls were thin enough that I could hear someone's game controller clicking until 2 in the morning, yet the bed felt like a declaration and the keycard in my pocket felt like proof that I could build a life from scratch if I chose to, and I did. I found work at the campus library reshelving returns during the early shift when the building was still quiet, and another shift at a sandwich shop where the bread ovens blasted heat that made my cheeks pink and my hair smell like toasted crust. And I learned quickly that you can stretch a jar of peanut butter through more meals than any brochure will ever admit, and that coffee, brewed in a dented French press left behind by a graduated senior, can forgive the worst nights. There were humiliations, of course, because independence always carries a price. I shrank a sweater I loved because I misread the washing machine settings and then pretended I had always wanted it cropped. I said yes to too many shifts and fell asleep in a lecture while my professor read attendance. I cried once in a bathroom stall after a girl complained I made sandwiches too slowly, then cleaned my face and went back to slice tomatoes like I was auditioning for a culinary marathon. My parents called the first Sunday night as if they had been keeping a schedule they never shared with me, my mother's voice bright and performative, full of the kind of cheer that is indistinguishable from measurement, asking about my little dorm, and whether I had met nice people, and then, casually, pivoting to Ethan because he had so much going on, because the truck needed careful handling, because he was really stepping up, and I sat there with my phone pressed to my ear, staring at the corkboard above my desk where I had pinned copies of my scholarship letter and my class schedule like talismans, and felt that old familiar heat in my throat, the one that used to make me say something I would regret. Instead, I said that I had plenty of work, that I was fine, that I had to go because the library shift started early, and as soon as the call ended I opened the student portal and filed the form that, in 3 lines and a signature, placed a permanent block on the release of my educational records to anyone, including parents, unless I chose otherwise. It was not dramatic, it would never trend on any platform, but it was my first clean act of revenge, signed with my legal name and a little tremor in my hand. The messages persisted for a while, because families are like tide, pulling back, surging forward, erasing footprints as if the beach belongs to them, and my mother tried every tone she owned, from concerned to baffled to mildly offended. leaving voicemails that managed to sound like I had forgotten a chore rather than a childhood, then upgrading to texts about holidays and recipes, and how Aunt Carol asked after me at church, until the afternoon she sent a photo of Ethan leaning against his truck, with a caption about, "How proud we are of him, and you'll find your path too," and I, who had promised myself I would act with grace, because grace was the one luxury they could not claim to have given me, felt something harden into clarity. I archived the thread without answering, deleted the contact name so the number looked generic and unimportant, blocked the group chat where relatives traded updates like coupons, and set up an email filter that swept anything from their addresses into a folder titled Inventory, a private museum of the noise I had survived, because I am not above admitting that a little organization can make grief easier to shelve. On campus, I built a life that was stubbornly ordinary and therefore beautiful, making friends who did not know about the truck or the kitchen table talk or the years spent learning how to become small on command. We studied in the atrium until security flicked the lights to signal closing. We sat on the grass and argued about electives. We took turns pretending to be immune to late-night fries. And when money ran low, I signed up for a research study that paid in grocery cards and wrote a short essay for a local foundation about resilience, an ugly word that sounds like a motivational poster until you've had to live it. And I used a cropped screenshot of that very truck photo as an illustration of why balanced families are not always balanced at the dinner table. I submitted the piece under a pen name because I was not naive about the reach of gossip, and when the foundation emailed to say the essay had won a modest stipend, I printed the acceptance note and pinned it to the corkboard under the scholarship letter like a second spine, not because I wanted to gloat, but because stacking proof felt like building ribs around a heart I intended to keep. Weeks later, when the sandwich shop scheduled me on a night I had a midterm the next morning and I hesitated to ask for a shift swap, an older coworker named Lila told me in a tone that tolerated no argument that we all get one emergency kindness per semester and that mine had arrived. So I took it and used the hours to review until the classroom whiteboard stopped blurring. And I walked out of that exam knowing I had done more than stay afloat, I had moved forward. That night my phone lit up with an unknown number that became my mother after the third sentence, breathless and honeyed, telling me that Ethan might be dating a girl from a better family, and wouldn't that be sweet? And I realized the call had found a gap in my filters, so I listened for a minute, let the syrup coat the line. Then, in a voice so calm it surprised even me, told her the university had a policy and I had signed it, that she should not call the dean, that she would not be given information, that I was safe, that I was fine, and that my time was not a runway for anyone else's celebration anymore. I ended the call, opened the privacy settings again, added the missing lockdown on directory visibility, and, because a little wit is sometimes practical as well as petty, I changed my displayed campus contact to a separate inbox that auto-replied with a polite note containing office hours for the dean's front desk and a link explaining the federal privacy law. It was a bureaucratic joke only I would ever laugh at, but in the quiet of my dorm it sounded like an anthem. By the time midterms dissolved into a blur of highlighter stains and empty coffee cups, the life I had promised myself I would build had begun to take a shape that felt suspiciously like stability. Not glamorous or cinematic, but sturdy in the way a well-made bookshelf is sturdy, each plank measured and leveled, each screw set with deliberate pressure, and although I knew better than to trust a good stretch after a childhood of sudden weather, I let myself practice the ordinary rituals of someone who expects to be here tomorrow, returning library books before the fines triggered, buying 2 identical black sweaters so I could rotate laundry without panic, bookmarking recipes that required a single pan and exactly the amount of spice packets left in my drawer, and answering emails with the calm authority of a person who understands that responding within a day is not a favor to anyone but herself. I found a mentor almost by accident when a professor called me after class to ask why I never raised my hand and then, without waiting for a defensive monologue, told me she recognized a student who had learned to stay quiet in rooms where quiet looked like survival, and that she would expect to see an outline of my final project in a week because talent had a shelf life and fear would not be permitted to eat it. I left her office carrying the kind of stern kindness that keeps its edge. And when I drafted the outline, I did not soften the part about the truck because there are truths that lose muscle when you sand them down. I made a game out of invisibility that year, which sounds dramatic until you understand it was nothing more than logistics dressed up as strategy. I set my social media to a version of private that required a map and a password. I created a public-facing student portfolio under my middle name so recruiters could find me while relatives could not. I turned off location tags and trained my friends to post group photos only after a delay and never with building names visible. And when someone laughed that I was acting like a secret agent, I grinned and said the mission was simple: graduate, get paid, and deny the gossip, mill a single grain to grind. The Scholarship Foundation asked if I would write a short thank you paragraph for their quarterly newsletter, and I agreed on the condition that they credit only my first initial and program, which made the blurb look strangely elegant and, to my great and slightly petty delight, made it impossible for certain people to print it out and pretend they had helped, because there is a particular satisfaction in being unclaimable by those who once tried to claim your limits. Money remained a puzzle with missing pieces, yet I learned to solve it anyway. Choosing a campus internship in the research office that paid better than the sandwich shop and gave me access to an ocean of bureaucratic knowledge I swam through like a kid who had finally found the deep end. I learned the names of the forms that lock down information, the timelines for graduation announcements, the email templates that sounded warm while revealing nothing, and I memorized the phone tree for the Dean Suite, not because I plan to use it, but because power begins with understanding who answers calls and who keeps the ledger. In a move that felt like equal parts insurance and art, I asked the registrar to flag my file for name rehearsal so the announcer at commencement would pronounce every syllable correctly. And when the assistant asked if I expected family to attend and needed extra tickets, I smiled into the handset and said I expected a complicated day and needed the dignity of accuracy. She laughed softly, the way people laugh when they recognize a bruise, and marked my request with a star. There were moments of crooked humor that kept me honest, like the afternoon a classmate offered me a ride home and I, without thinking, refused because I could not bear the sight of another truck dashboard. Then covered my flinch by launching into a passionate lecture on the environmental benefits of walking, or the evening my roommate discovered the inventory email folder on my laptop and, after I explained its purpose with more levity than it deserved, suggested I install a filter that forwarded certain family addresses straight to a dead-end inbox named Dealership Promo, which we both agreed was childish for exactly 5 seconds before we set it up, toasted our immaturity with stale cookies, and slept better than we had all week. When a local paper ran a tiny piece on scholarship recipients, listing only programs and a cropped headshot that obscured everything but my jawline and the shadow of my cap, a former neighbor messaged a mutual acquaintance to ask if it was me, and because the acquaintance had learned my rules, she simply replied that talented students often resemble each other in photographs, which is a sentence so polite you could frame it without anyone noticing the barbed wire. The revenge for that season arrived in a form both civilized and merciless. My high school counselor asked if I would permit her to share an anonymized case study at a regional conference on student privacy, demonstrating how federal protections allow first-generation students to navigate college without family interference when necessary, and I said yes with a professionalism that did not reveal how fast my pulse jumped, then edited the draft with careful strokes to include a detail that only my parents' circle would recognize, a reference to a celebratory purchase that undermined a daughter's education, and when the slides were posted after the conference, wrapped in neutral fonts and bland bullet points, I watched the view count tick upward and imagined the uncomfortable silence in a church basement somewhere as a woman recognized her reflection in a sentence stripped of names. The counselor sent me a thank you note and a gift card for groceries because she understood the math of dignity, and I used it to buy better coffee for finals, a luxury that felt like permission to think clearly under fluorescent lights. On the first day of graduation week, as the campus bloomed with families carrying bouquets and new shoes, I received a brief message from the dean's assistant, not alarmed but curious, asking me to confirm whether I had relatives who might contact the office for List verification, a phrase that means far less than it implies, and I felt the room tilt by a fraction as all my careful walls hummed in unison, because the tide had remembered my name and was coming in, slow and relentless, and I was about to learn whether my maps and passwords and starred requests could hold. Graduation week arrived with the kind of artificial cheer that makes even the happiest people suspicious. Banners strung between lampposts like polite commands to celebrate, flower vendors setting up at dawn, families rehearsing compliments in hotel elevators, and in the middle of that curated joy, I moved like someone fitting a key into a complicated lock, because every detail mattered now, from the cards in my wallet to the timing of my footsteps. And I intended to finish what I had started, without a single note out of place. I picked up my cap and gown from the distribution hall where volunteers with clipboards tried to manufacture a sense of community by asking for major and hometown. And when one of them looked up with a smile that had been practiced in a mirror and asked if my family would be taking photos on the quad, I said that my plans were still forming, which was true in the way that a storm is still forming even as it already roars at sea, since the plan was less about photos than about choreography, and the choreography began with tickets that I distributed like guarded currency to friends who had earned their front row view by showing up for me when it cost them sleep. The dean's assistant, who had learned the rhythm of my requests over the past months and who possessed that rare administrative compassion that looks like steel wrapped in velvet, called to confirm pronunciation and seating and whether I needed accessibility accommodations for any guests, and when I said that my guests were fully capable of finding an entrance if they chose to purchase a map, she laughed softly and told me that, as a courtesy, the office had prepared a standard response for anyone asking whether I was graduating, a response that cited policy and nothing else, and then she added, in a tone that balanced confidentiality with friendship, that she had already fielded 2 polite inquiries from numbers with no names attached, both asking if a young woman with my first name might be among the candidates, and that she had, with practiced grace, declined to confirm. I thanked her without theatrics, because gratitude needed to be clean if it was going to survive what came next. And after we hung up, I sat at my desk and drafted a short message to my closest circle with instructions that read like stage directions, arrival windows, meeting points, a ban on live posting until after the ceremony, and a contingency plan for the possibility that a photographer with a familiar face appeared at the edge of the crowd, holding a phone like a badge. In the days leading up to the ceremony, my inbox performed a nervous dance of auto-replies and filtered echoes, the inventory folder swelling with forwarded messages that sounded at once contrite and accusatory, as though I had snuck out of a family portrait while the flash was warming up, and among the digital confessions a single line stood out, a message relayed through a cousin who should have known better, stating that my mother had been sick with worry and that she only wanted to know if we were still her people, a phrase so expertly loaded it could have been crafted by a marketing team, except this campaign had always been run in a living room where the audience was expected to clap on cue. I did not reply, because the point was not to teach them how to speak to me. The point was to demonstrate that access is a privilege earned by behavior, and behavior is measured over years, and years had already told their story. There is a particular kind of loneliness that finds you on the cusp of triumph, the silence before your name is called where you realize you have planned every logistic except the moment your throat tightens for reasons that have nothing to do with fear. And so I engineered a distraction worthy of my pettiness and my need for control, asking a friend from the research office to schedule a batch email from the dean's generic account to go out exactly 15 minutes before the procession, an automated note reminding families to take their seats promptly because the aisles must remain clear, and while the message would go to all registered addresses, I knew from a quietly obtained list of open rates that the people most likely to treat mass emails as personal invitations were the very ones who once assumed the world would pause for their parking decisions. If they came at all, I wanted them in a chair, facing forward, obeying rules announced in a voice that wasn't mine. At the same time, I delivered a sealed manila envelope to the registrar marked with my signature and a terse instruction to release nothing and to reroute any walk-in inquiries to a printed card explaining federal privacy law in gentle language. And I paired it with a handwritten thank you that mentioned nothing of trucks or birthdays or the endless arithmetic of favoritism, because formality can be a blade when you carry it with intention. The night before the ceremony, I walked the perimeter of the arena with Lila, who had taken a night off from the sandwich shop and who insisted on conducting a final inspection like we were about to stage a live production rather than a rite of passage that universities have executed since parchment was a cutting-edge technology. And together we counted entrances and exits and identified a corner near the loading bay where we could breathe for 30 seconds before the march began, and she listened without judgment as I rehearsed what I would do if I saw them, eyes forward, pace steady, no speeches, no scenes, just the quiet power of a person who knows that forgiveness and access are not synonyms. When we finished our lap, she pressed a small velvet ribbon into my palm, a relic from a year I knew had not been easy for her either, and told me to tie it under the edge of my gown so I would feel it brush against my wrist as I walked. A private sign that I belonged to the family I had chosen. On the morning itself, the sky turned the color of clean paper, cool and bright, and the campus smelled faintly of cut grass and coffee, and I dressed with the slow care of someone preparing for a legal proceeding, smoothing the gown, pinning the cap, tucking the velvet ribbon where it would touch skin, and then I left my room without looking back because sentimentality had not paid a single bill. Halfway to the arena, my phone buzzed with a message from the dean's assistant containing exactly 5 words. Your file flag was useful, which meant the systems I had built were holding, and yet, as the brass warmed up and the graduates gathered in their assigned rows and the lights dimmed with institutional precision, another message arrived, this one uncharacteristically blunt for an office that preferred euphemism, asking me to know, before I stepped onto the floor, that a woman claiming to be my mother was at the front desk, eyes red and voice trembling, insisting she needed my location. Because she was afraid something terrible had happened, and for a breath so long it felt like a lifetime, I stood perfectly still, listening to the crowd settle like surf, and then I exhaled, tightened the ribbon with my fingers, and took my place in line while the assistant typed her next sentence, which began with the words, "We can escort her to." The procession unfurled like a carefully rehearsed lie that had finally decided to tell the truth, rows of robes moving in deliberate tides while the brass section did its best impression of triumph. And as the doors to the arena opened and the rush of conditioned air met the warm breath of thousands of people who believed this moment belonged to them, I felt the velvet ribbon brush my wrist like a pulse that had waited 4 years to be counted. And I understood with a steadiness that surprised me that the revenge I had spent so long imagining would not arrive as a thunderclap or a public shaming or a cinematic confrontation under harsh lights, but as a series of small, impeccably executed choices that left no blood on the floor and no apology in my throat. The dean's assistant, who had become my unlikely co-conductor in this symphony of boundaries, sent one final message before the march began. We can escort her to seating if you want. Otherwise, the office will provide printed policy and offer tissues, and I stared at the sentence long enough to feel my heartbeat slow, because there it was, the fork I had known was coming, a short path toward reconciliation dressed up as concern, or a longer path toward adulthood that refused to confuse tears with penance. I typed 2 words, policy, please, and slid the phone into the inner pocket of my gown, where it would rest against the fabric like a sealed verdict. We stepped forward on the cue, tassels swaying, the announcer testing the microphone with a practiced half-joke, and in that walk I allowed myself the rare luxury of memory, not as an anchor, but as a measuring tape. Revisiting the kitchen table with the magnet and the speech about being broke, revisiting the driveway with the red bow and the confetti congratulations that tasted like cardboard, revisiting the dorm with the stale air and the first morning I woke without the sound of their expectations rattling the window frame, and I felt not anger, because anger would have given them too much, so much as a clean, clinical recognition of cause and effect that would have made any statistician proud. The names began, careful and rhythmic, a litany of futures projected into the rafters, and I scanned the faces in the lower bowl not to find the 2 who had come too late, but to locate the people who had earned their seats near the aisle. Friends who had learned my rules and honored them without needing a manual, Lila with her hair pinned up and her eyes bright. My mentor with a tissue she would pretend was for allergies. The research office crew pressed shoulder to shoulder like a single long sibling who had studied my privacy settings and decided to adopt them as a family creed. When the announcer reached the cluster where my row waited and paused to confirm the starred pronunciation, I felt the room sharpen, that subtle intake of communal breath that precedes a shared moment, and I realized, almost laughed, really, at the absurdity that dignity can hinge on syllables, that entire histories can be honored or erased by the difference between a flat vowel and a rounded one. So when he spoke my name exactly as I had rehearsed with him, not a note out of place, I walked. Not in triumph, but in precise acceptance of what I had earned, the applause arriving like weather I had predicted with spreadsheets and stubbornness. The stage felt cooler than the floor below, and the president's handshake was dry and quick, and as the diploma cover pressed against my palm, I felt the velvet ribbon again, and understood that the revenge had already occurred. Not in this handshake or the applause or the flash of a camera operated by a stranger, but in the locked office where a woman who once told me there was no money for my life had to listen to a staff member explain, with professional gentleness, that her daughter's records were protected not because the university was cruel, but because the daughter had finally learned that love without boundaries is just a costume for control. I did not look for her as I crossed, because the point was not to deprive myself of a view in order to catch hers. The point was to keep faith with the person who had written essays at 3 in the morning and sliced tomatoes until her wrists ached and learned the phone tree of an institution so large it could not remember her name without a star beside it. And that person deserved a forward gaze, so I gave it to her, to me, to the future that did not need a witness to exist. At the base of the stage, an usher directed me down a narrow ramp, and in that corridor where the noise softened into a hum I allowed exactly one indulgence, fishing my phone from the pocket to see if the assistant had written again, and she had. Sending a concise update that read, "She asked if you were safe." I said yes, followed by, "She asked if you were here." I said policy, and then, softer even through text, "She asked if you would forgive her." I said that was not a registrar matter. Which should not have made me smile and yet did, because sometimes the only thing better than a well-timed joke is a bureaucrat who knows where mercy ends. After the recessional, sunlight hit the arena steps with the kind of optimism that turns strangers generous, and my friends surged toward me with flowers that smelled like early decisions and laughter that tasted like late-night fries. And we took the photos we had agreed to post on a delay, and I tucked the diploma cover under my arm like a practical shield, and for a moment that stretched long and thin and bright, I almost turned toward the administrative building, almost took the corridor that would deliver me to a woman with red eyes and a script about worry and a purse full of tissue, almost offered her the relief of seeing my face in exchange for the comfort of ending a story neatly. Instead, I led my people toward the loading bay exit where the crowd thins and the air warms, and as we crossed into daylight, I told them an edited version of the office scene, not to gloat, but to mark the footprint of a boundary that, if left unmarked, would be trampled by the next tide. And when Lila pressed the velvet ribbon flat against my wrist to keep it from loosening, I understood the twist I had been riding toward for 4 years. The revenge was not the absence I handed my parents, it was the presence I gave myself. Immediate and complete and unborrowed, which is either the cruelest decision a daughter can make or the kindest one a grown woman can live with, and I have learned that the truth depends on who is telling the story and whether they can bear a silence that will not justify itself.